What I would like to do today is to talk to you basically about my story as the first Muslim chaplain on active duty in the Department of Defense. This is actually you all will be the first ones to actually hear this narrative because I just retired a month ago. And having said that, I should also say that recently I've been selected to be the first in another area. And that is, I will continue my ministerial experience with the Department of Veteran Affairs, and I will be located in Baltimore at the Baltimore VA Medical Center and at the VA Medical Center in Perry Point, Maryland, which is the largest VA medical facility in the state of Maryland. I'm very privileged and I feel very grateful for that opportunity to serve in that capacity, because it will give me the opportunity to continue to work with our veterans and their families, to work with many of the administrators, many of the religious leaders, and community activists as we move towards finding solutions to help our soldiers who have served most recently in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we all, of course, hear daily about the onslaught of post-traumatic stress disorder, and it matters not what your religious preference is. If you're in this business of human service delivery, you will be impacted by those soldiers or family members that have been impacted by the war. Let me first, before I get started, ask how many of you this afternoon, have served on active duty. Let me just see by a show of hands. How many veterans do we have here today? One, okay. How many of you have an immediate relative who have served on active duty? A father, a mother, brother, sister? How many of you had an uncle or an aunt, an extended family member? Okay, very good, thank you. So even though many of you have not experienced the life of being a soldier, an airman, or a Marine, or a sailor, you've known someone who have. And this is a good thing, in my opinion, because every nation requires a defense capability to protect its freedoms. And many years ago, when I contemplated, I'm actually, I was Vietnam era eligible, as a matter of fact, but I didn't get selected to go into the military service during the Vietnam War. And I was kind of, in a way, glad I didn't, because I kind of like our system the way it works now, where you have the opportunity to, make the personal decision, just like we make other personal decisions, like attending this university, for example, or when to get married. Personal choices. So I made the personal choice to serve my country. I didn't become a Johnny-come-lately when it comes to service or love and respect for the freedoms that we have, and sometimes that we take for granted. But I felt an obligation and a commitment to show that loyalty, that love, that respect, that discipline by using the talents that God has given me to help others. Prior to military service, I served as a licensed clinical social worker here in the state of Michigan, in Ypsilanti and Ann Arbor in Washtenaw County. And after I left here in 1992, I received a phone call that I would, I was actually working in the, when I left here in 1992, I worked for about 2 years in the Department of Corrections as a chaplain in the Department of Corrections in New York. I worked in a medium men's and a medium women's correctional facility as a chaplain. And it was shortly after that that I received a phone call one day when I was at work at the correctional facility that I was selected as the nation's first Muslim chaplain. Thank you. Obviously, it didn't take a whole long time for me to make a decision that I was going to leave the prison and I was going to serve. Not only because I was the first, because I would have served if I was the 5th or the 10th. But obviously to be given the privilege to be a pioneer at anything, it provides its own set of challenges and benefits. So I want to talk to you this afternoon about some of those challenges. And one of the things I learned was that, as the Quran says, as God says in the Quran, فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا. Verily, with every difficulty comes ease or relief. And the way I understand that in this context is that I should not have expected to receive any benefits unless I had challenges to go along with it. And so one of my initial challenges was somehow to be able to navigate my own Muslim community into an area of acceptance of what I was about to do, because no one had done it before me. Oh, we've had many people served. Muslims have served in the United States Armed Forces, whether you know it or not, since the American Revolution. And if you've never visited the Muslim American Museum, you should, in Washington, D.C. It's something that is eye-opening. But I was privileged to have the opportunity to be the first to tread this territory. And now we have 11 Muslim chaplains in the armed services. And I believe that the momentum there has also helped us to achieve chaplaincy positions in other institutions, like our universities. More of our women have taken on chaplain positions. And I believe our Muslim community has a much deeper understanding, a much more robust understanding of what chaplaincy actually is. For a moment, I'll digress and I'll just say a little bit about what chaplaincy actually is. Because to be a chaplain basically means that one has to have the desire to love people. All people, not just those who come under the rubric of your congregation, whether you're a rabbi, a priest, a pastor, or an imam. And depending upon the institutional bureaucratic environment that you may work in, you may be called at times to work with, for those who are not a part of your congregational flock. And you must do it with the type of commitment as though they were. When I worked in the prisons, there were periodic times that I had to give death notices to inmates who were not of my religious background. And on active duty as a battalion chaplain, which is an entry-level job in the military, in the Army, the battalion is about 800 soldiers. Only about 4 of them were, out of that 800 in my first assignment at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Only about my first assignment, there was about 450 people. I was in the 28th Combat Support Hospital, and I only had 2 Muslims out of 450. But all of the 450 people and those that had wives and children were mine. They belonged to me. I was responsible for them, for their spiritual welfare and well-being. And they came to know not only about me and Islam, but also what the possibilities were of having someone that was an other, in one sense, to become their spiritual advisor. One time when I was at Fort Bragg, I went to the hospital and visited an old man who was about 80 years old. He was originally from South Carolina. Now, I was brought up in Buffalo, New York, up north. And for those of you that are from up north, you know, sometimes we have issues with people of European American background from the South, from the history. This is our history. And I was a little bit uncertain about how this particular pastoral engagement was going to turn out. Well, me and this man, who was very red in skin color, ended up getting so close to each other that he gave me something that I still have today. It was a 1949 model Cadillac that he had put together himself. As a token of his appreciation and of his love and respect for me as a chaplain. So that's a single example of how sometimes we may project what something might be, and we don't give ourselves permission just to be who we are or who God has called us to be in the midst of somebody else's suffering or pain. And who knows, that man may have had as much anxiety as I did. But the outcome is that not only did he demonstrate that he had less anxiety than me, he was able to demonstrate that if necessary, he could care for me better than I was able to care for him initially. So this is the way that a chaplain has to respond. You can't go into a situation, look on the door, look at the name and say, oh, I can't go in that room if you work in a hospital. I can't talk to that person because I think they might be Catholic. You have to be the type of heart to say, no, that person is a human being. And this is the presenting problem. And this is what I can offer. And when we give ourselves permission to perform our ministry that way, as I learned to do, as I had the desire to do, it just enhanced my ability to work with people again and again and again, and get stronger in it and develop better at it, and to eventually become a supervisor of other chaplains from different faith group backgrounds. Because it's one thing to be a chaplain yourself and minister to your own flock as an imam or a pastor or a rabbi would do in a church, in a synagogue, or a mosque, but it's another thing to be in an institution and then be able to minister those people and maybe perhaps one day even supervise others who may come from those dominant faith groups, as I had the opportunity to do in the United States Army. And one of my challenges was that I had a chaplain who didn't think too kindly of Muslims. He was from Texas. He had never grown up around African Americans. But it really had nothing to do with me personally, because he really didn't know me personally. He was just afraid of what he thought I represented in his fantasy world. But he got over it. I got over it. And we deployed to Iraq together, and we did what we had to do. and we came back. And we appreciated each other that much more after that experience. So this is the foundation from which I think all of us who are looking into chaplaincy as perhaps a career opportunity need to understand that, you know, it's one thing to be in an Islamic center, it's one thing to be in a mosque, it's one thing to be in an area where you have, you know, a very controlled environment. And you may be the one who gets the last word most of the time, like most imams do. But when you're in a situation where you may not get the last word, you may not always be the one that people will come to, but you still have a seat at the table. You still have a place. When I worked at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, I always made sure that people knew whenever we had case conferences or discharge planning meetings, I wanted them to know that this chair belonged to the chaplain. Not the Muslim chaplain, but the chaplain. And so, you know, my approach was always in that vein, coming across that way. And this I learned from Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. When he sent his companions to Abyssinia, he knew exactly what he was doing. And he knew that in order for the community to be protected, he had to trust others, the others that sometimes we get very anxious about. And so the example of how we should treat the others, how we should be ourselves as helping professionals has already been demonstrated for us. So I never felt like I needed to go into this to reinvent something. My second greatest challenge was to learn as much as I could about how Prophet Muhammad did things, peace and blessings be upon him, in most every situation that I could possibly find the information, and then try and pattern myself after those examples. Or I would consult with others more learned than myself in certain situations to get the best advice about how to proceed in medical situations, in situations that might involve religious accommodations, in situations that might involve women's rights. And so it was much easier for me to deal with these challenges as I learned more about how the best example for humanity had handled them, rather than trying to always figure it out on my own, feeling as though I had to have the answer. The Muslim community is not monolithic. We are very diverse. We have Shiites, we have Sunnis, we have people who are Sufi, and all of these people are in uniform. When people used to ask me who my congregation was, I said basically they're the same people that's out here in America. Because from each of these groups, there will be people who will serve this country, regardless to what their parents may think or what their imam may think. I have encountered all kinds of soldiers who have come into military service against the advice of somebody. And the respect and admiration that I've personally had for them has only empowered me to be that much more energized. Because I used to tell them all the time, one of my more favorite sayings was, if you weren't here, I wouldn't have a job. That's why I decided to do what I did. It's because they decided to do what they did. And what I have seen over the years of my career is that whatever I experienced or whatever they experienced as Muslim soldiers, it was always the same. It was parallel. And I used to tell them, it doesn't matter whether you're an officer, whether you're enlisted, you're a Muslim. When Ramadan comes around, I'm going to experience the same things you experience. For example, one of the big issues was, can soldiers do PT during Ramadan? Can they run? PT is physical training. I know we use a lot of acronyms in the Army, so if I use one and forget to say what it is, just raise your hand and I'll do that. I'll explain it. But PT is physical training. So during Ramadan, you have some soldiers who are so disciplined. Fort Jackson, South Carolina, where I was assigned as an instructor at the Chaplain School and also the largest basic training installation in the Army, we have most of our soldiers are enlisted young soldiers. They come through there. And I used to have classes with them. And they would come to me and ask me, Imam, you know, my sergeant won't let me fast. Because they say I have to do PT and I have to have water. And I would meet with them, oftentimes, and consult with them. And I would tell them that they don't have the authority to not allow someone to at least begin the fast and see what the results would be. And with that, whenever they complied with that, there was never a soldier that did not complete the fast while going through their basic training. So to have been there as a representative was so important for many of those soldiers. And so many of those young soldiers, as those who used to come to our classes, took Shahada. From hearing about the reality of what Islam truly was, as opposed to what they would think or what they heard through media sources and whatnot about what Islam was. Then there was 9/11. During 9/11, September the 11th, 2001, I was assigned to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and I deployed to the Pentagon right after it was hit. And if any of you were in Washington, D.C. at that time, you know you couldn't get within a mile of the Pentagon after this happened. The only ones could get there were those who were there doing some type of work, either removing bodies from the wreckage, or in our case, medical personnel, chaplains, mental health professionals. We were there ministering and providing critical incident stress debriefing for those that were. And a team of myself, a psychologist, a social worker, and a nurse every day went from Walter Reed Army Medical Center to the Pentagon. And we ministered to those soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division, or the Old Guard, who were going in the building and removing the body parts. Plus, I had to do Salatul Jummah right down there on the grounds, where many of my Muslim soldiers was also there doing some type of job, some type of function. And then the second week, I had to do the Jummah inside the Pentagon. And the smoke and the gasoline and all the jet fuel, you could still smell it. So you could imagine, if you could imagine yourself being in a situation like that on a day-to-day basis. And one of my concerns was that people weren't going to accept me. They were going to be hostile towards me. They were going to be angry. And it never happened one day. Not one single day. Now, you can look at it on a spiritual level and say, oh, well, Allah was protecting you, brother. And I certainly accept that. Because I believe wherever I go, Allah protects me. But I also knew that there's something in the spirit of the American people that when you put that uniform on, people don't care what your religious background is. When they see me, when they've seen me coming through the airport with my uniform on, I've never had a person do to me what was done to some of our soldiers during the Vietnam War era. Exactly the opposite now. Thank you for your service. Now, unfortunately, I must say to you, I haven't gotten that a whole lot from the Muslim community. And that's been the sort of catch-22. But one day I was sitting in the airport in Dallas, and this little 6 or 7-year-old girl ran up to me and gave me a piece of candy and said, "Thank you for your service." One of the most heartwarming things I ever experienced. Now, she was with her mother. Certainly her mother told her to go and do it. But this is the type of spirit. She didn't look at my uniform to see what my name was. She just saw the uniform. And that is the basic experience that I have encountered since 9/11 and going through airports, especially when I was in uniform. Now, I've also gone through airports with a kufi on, this, and have experienced exactly the opposite. Take everything out of your pockets, what are you doing with this Quran, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, yes. In fact, I did it once on purpose, right after 9/11, just to see, as a kind of experiment, whether there would be a difference in treatment. And when I had the kufi on, I was asked a whole lot of questions. When I came through in uniform, it was yes, sir, no, sir. Same person, same individual, but it let me know the distinction and how just what you wear can also have a major impact on people's thinking. But it strengthened me in my resolve for my ministry as a Muslim chaplain on active duty. One of the last challenges that I encountered was the tragedy at Fort Hood. I knew Nadel Hassan. I had spoken to him. He was an intern at Walter Reed when I was there. And it was me who recommended that he be a layperson at Fort Hood, pardon me. But I had no clue that he was going to do what he actually did, nor did I have any idea that he was thinking about or had any inclination to do what he actually did. But he came and sat in 2 or 3 of my khutbahs right before I left to go to Fort Hood when I was at Walter Reed. I left there in 2002. And he actually came there. Like I said, he was a resident. He did his residency there. Psychiatric residency? Yeah, he did his psychiatry residency at Walter Reed when I was there as a chaplain. And that's when we met. He used to attend the masjid there in Springfield, Maryland. So the only thing I knew about him was he was a psychiatrist and he used to come to Jummah. Seemed to be okay. They needed a layperson out at Fort Hood. He had the rank. He had the knowledge. And so we learned something from that. Now we do things a little differently when we select lay people. That was a lesson learned. And it is, as unfortunate as it was, one of the things, again, that I learned, that whatever I experienced, whatever anxiety I experienced, I knew that all my Muslim soldiers were also going through the same thing. So it was it was a very difficult time when that took place. So I was called by the FBI. They had 2 phone calls on his phone that had my number on it. And right before he did this, he called me and told me that some soldiers had broken his windows in his car because he had on a bumper sticker that Islam is the way. And as a result of that, some soldiers, more than likely, damaged his car, damaged his vehicle. And this was about a month before this had taken place. So, of course, they called me to find out, how did I know him? What did we talk about? Blah, blah, blah. I was always very honest with them, very upfront, invited them to Jummah, et cetera, et cetera. Nothing to hide, nothing to be ashamed of. I mean, it was certainly obviously a very tragic situation. It was a very traumatic situation, and it caused a lot of difficulty in our community. But these are the things that not only as chaplains, but as a Muslim community, and particularly as professionals, we have to find ourselves ready for and hopefully prepared for, in terms of our training, in terms of our knowledge, in terms of our networking capabilities. All of those things, we have to make sure that we are absolutely ready for whatever contingency that comes our way. We have a major crisis right now in Syria that is going to eventually be at our doorstep, whether we know it or not. And many of the people who are in Turkey will eventually become refugees to this country. Who do you think they're going to go to? They're going to go to the mosques and the Islamic centers throughout the United States, wherever they're placed. And they're going to depend on people like you and me for support. So my question is to you, is that as these particular world events continue to impact us professionally and personally, how ready and prepared are we to deal with them? This is hard work. It's not easy. But it is work that we have to be prepared for, that we have to be professionally and personally ready to deal with. And I would also say that we have to allow ourselves to be ready to work with others collaboratively outside of our circle and not just depend on ourselves. The communities are getting too small, and the walls are not as tall as they used to be. They're coming down. And we're being forced, whether we want to or not, to work closer and closer and closer with one another, as Christians, as Jews, as Muslims, as human beings. The benefits have been tremendous, absolutely tremendous. Invitations to the White House for iftar, countless numbers of shahadas, soldiers, family members, establishing all kinds of policies for religious accommodations and influencing the system on First Amendment as it relates to religious accommodations and Muslims in particular. having the opportunity to do all kinds of training on Islam to those who never heard anything about Islam in their life, who have the responsibility to impact Muslims 24/7. So those are just sort of, in a very capsulized way, some of the things that I wanted you to have some idea of what this vessel standing before you has had to encounter. And whatever you have heard, know that there's been hundreds of others just like me going through the same thing. My concern is that if they're not doing okay with the experiences that they have encountered, I want to make sure that they go to the right places to get the help that they need. That's the thing that's important now. It's not whether or not we should be on active duty as Muslims, or the reality is, and I've told Muslims this for many years, there are things that are going to happen in our lives that we cannot control. We either learn to accept them and deal with them or move on. The reality is, if we allow ourselves to get stuck because we can't change it, all we do is just mess up our own lives. I've chosen to train and read and try and prepare myself, and to forgive and to love and to move on. That's what I've chosen to do. And I hope that you also have chosen to do that in your own way, in your own special ways, so that we can truly be able to take on the major tasks that lie before us. And I think that we're becoming more and more prepared to do that, because I can remember a time not too long ago where you couldn't get imams and mental health people in the same room. It wasn't that long ago. I'm serious. And because I made the decision to put that uniform on, people have come to accept that, even though they don't want to, because they know they can't change it. And that's just the way life goes. I think it was mentioned this morning that the earth or the ground is moving under us all the time and things are constantly shifting. That is a true statement. And even as we speak, the ground is shifting and things are changing. So I thank you all for your attention, and especially after lunch, where it is very difficult to keep one's eyes open and alert. But in looking around, I think I only saw 2 or 3 people who actually dozed, and you know who you are. I am not going to call you out. I'm not going to dime you, but you know who you are. May God bless all of us. May we continue to do the good work that we're doing. Let us continue to work collaboratively. I don't know if we have about 5 minutes to take some questions. I'd like to do that. So at this particular time, if you all have any questions of me, I'd like to take a couple of questions right now, if you would, please.
Hello, my name is Ivory Smith. I'm an intercultural aide in on that side of campus, Brody. And I was just wondering, I heard chaplain a lot. Can you just clarify what exactly are the responsibilities of chaplains?
Yes, basically the responsibility of a chaplain, as opposed to when we use this term chaplain, it is a professional term like lawyer or doctor that most anyone can use regardless to what their religious background is. So a Muslim can be a chaplain, a Jewish person could be a Jewish religious leader can be a chaplain, a Catholic religious leader or priest can be a chaplain. A Protestant minister can also be a chaplain. The origin of the word is it comes from the word chapel or chapelle, and it means the person who sits in the chapel, which has its history, its origin in Christianity. But because in our pluralistic society here in America, there are so many groups and so many people who now work in multiple settings that work with the same people outside of their religious background. We have to have language that is common. So when we say doctor, we know what we're talking about. When we say nurse, we know what we're talking about. And when we say chaplain, what that means is that is the religious professional that normally works in an institution. Doesn't have to be of any particular background in terms of faith background, but you know that they've been trained, they've been certified, usually at the master's degree level, and they normally have one or two other certifications to go along with their master's degree, and usually in theology or divinity school. And you normally have some other kind of training background. Because we do a lot of counseling. We don't just do rituals like prayers and memorial services, but we also do a lot of counseling. We do grief counseling, we do marriage counseling, we do personal counseling, all kinds of counseling. So we have to have counseling skills as well. Good question.
Any other questions? Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Silver. I'm
Good
also
afternoon.
an intercultural aide. And earlier this school year, I had a resident come to me saying that she wanted to learn more about the Islam faith, and I wanted to know what are some good ways to direct her in her starting point.
Good question. I'll turn that over to Dr. Farah.
So, we have someone here from East Lansing Islamic Center. They offer a lot of educational programs. You can also go and visit as a group. And why don't I let Brother Tessin and Brother Musa answer that? Brother Tessin. He's the president of East Lansing Islamic Center.
Thank you for your inquiry. The easiest way to contact the Islamic Center is online. Go to our website, lansingislam.com. And these days, everybody pretty much has Facebook. We also have an active Facebook page. So try and interact with us on the Facebook page. Once you submit an inquiry, we'll try and get somebody to contact whoever is interested, and we'll take it from there. We have open tours of the masjid. So anyone who's interested, they can come. Feel free to ask questions. Go around the mosque. It's open from morning prayer until the last prayer in the night. The only time we lock it is after the last prayer in the night. Anybody is welcome. You don't have to be a Muslim to come and observe. So please feel welcome anytime. Yeah, we have 2 Friday prayers, 2 services in order to accommodate all the people. It's at 12:15 p.m. and again at 1:45 p.m. Yeah, usually amongst women, we have a couple study circles every Friday evening. It's usually after the evening prayer. One is in English and one is in Arabic for Arabic-speaking sisters. Yeah, on campus we have an active Muslim Students Association. They also have like an Islamic Awareness Week once in a year, and they have monthly lectures. And there's a diversity dinner, which is very well attended by about 500 people. It usually takes place like in March and April.
Hi, my name is Luis. I wanted to refer back to your last statement where you said, I can't remember if I have a hearing problem, so I don't know if I heard Iman or Ahmad, where you said it was unheard of to have the same people in with mental professionals, and I just wanted to know what the history behind that was exactly. Like, why would it be so crazy to have somebody, I'm guessing it's a religious figure, with mental professionals in the same room?
It's a good question, Luis. Yes, good question, Luis. Yeah, that's one of those loaded areas, and I'll try and unpack it for you. Typically, there's a lot of stigma that goes along with mental health. You've heard of terms like shrink and crazy and so forth. There's also some shame that sometimes is accompanied with people having to see a mental health professional or be referred to a mental health professional. So I know in the Army, for example, we tend to get more referrals from our soldiers as chaplains than people in mental health will, at least self-referrals. People will come to us more on their own volition, more readily as a chaplain than they will if I was a social worker, working in a social worker role. And the primary reason for that is because of stigma. In the Army, particularly in the infantry, there's a great deal of a shame that goes along with having to go see a mental health professional. And this is one of the things that the Army is working very hard to change. But that's one of the big areas why the two areas have had a difficulty sort of coming together. The other is, I think, has to do with just kind of a personal philosophy of how spirituality, if you will, how that's looked at as this kind of separate thing over here, and emotional and psychological issues is kind of this separate thing over there. But when you really look at it, the word spirit, actually in the Greek, it means the mind. So it's actually the same thing. But the disciplines have been divided, subdivided by sort of the way of how problems are looked at and how it's perceived that they could best be taken care of. There's also a sanction against, with some people, and particularly in religious circles, of using medication. There's a great stigma of taking medication for psychiatric illness. So those are some of the reasons that the professions, the two professions, have not necessarily come together historically the way we're working closer together now. I think we're doing a better job talking to each other, sitting at the same table, realizing there's common ground, et cetera, but we still have a ways to go.
My and actually, just to complement what Imam Abdul Rasheed was going through, I have a friend who was telling me that when he was at a base, he was not on active deployment, but nonetheless he was on a base doing a lot of counseling, actually, like yourself, and he was actually talking about issues which initially it was the first time where I was exposed to the amount of Muslims who are in the armed forces, and the story which he told me was that there were two female soldiers who had accepted Islam on the base. And due to uniform reasons, they couldn't necessarily wear a hijab or a headscarf when they wanted to pray. So what he actually told me that they said that that though it was an issue, it didn't stop them from going on and praying. So they used to just turn their caps backwards and pray as they had to pray. But as Imam Abdul Rasheed highlighted, that this is a whole demographic that we need to, not keep in the back of our heads. Remember that these are people who are there actually. Many of us, part of the Muslim community, we're not exposed to too many soldiers or too many people in active duty. And as he also said, that whether we are going to sit there and discuss whether or not they should be in their first place, the realist will say that they're already there. How can we help them out from that position? So, Jazakallah khair.
And I know, by the way, there are sons and daughters and nieces and nephews. They're not somebody from another world. These Muslims who we're talking about in the military are our sons and daughters. That's who they are. Okay? So, I mean, I've worked with every ethnic group that exists on this planet in uniform. So everybody in this room, regardless of what your ethnic background is, I've worked with somebody just like you that's a Muslim.
Any other questions? All right, Jermaine.
Yes, my
I know
brother.
the answer, but I want you to hear from you. What's the biggest or stereotype or mythology that comes from being a Muslim in America's army or America's military? That's it.
I'm sorry, say that again.
It is as far as a stereotype or some type of tabooism as far as being a Muslim in the army or in the military.
Yeah.
What is that for you? Somebody that dealing with it. What's the biggest stereotype as far as dealing with it? As far like what do you normally go through from Muslims dealing by you being in the military?
I think that there's still a number of people in our Islamic community throughout the United States, regardless to what the demographics are, that still have some difficulty with acceptance of Muslims on active duty, quite honestly, for a number of different reasons. I've not done a survey to get any quantitative or qualitative information on that, but my experience tells me that it does exist. But similarly, I could also say that the same thing exists when it comes to interracial marriage between Muslims. That also exists. So we have all kinds of prejudices and reasons for doing or not doing things that sometimes, and we talk about this elephant in the room, it's always there. But we don't necessarily confront it. But it comes out in different ways. My thing has been, my philosophy has always been is that, I'm a Muslim and I'm an American. So, there's never been any incongruence in my heart with my service. I believe that I've been called to do what I do. And I don't think that there's anything else that I could have done in this world as good as I do what I do as a chaplain and what I've done in the Army. So there's no reason for me personally, one of the questions has been, well, you have to go to a Muslim country, don't you? And you have to kill Muslims. That was probably the number one. If you take a survey, that's probably the number one. But first of all, chaplains don't carry weapons. So I don't kill anybody. I could get killed if my chaplain assistants don't shoot straight. But reality is that we have Muslims killing Muslims every day, with Americans not being in the mix. And oftentimes when that happens, it's the Muslims on the ground who are wondering where the Americans are to help. So, a lot of politics and a lot of other things get involved often with our values and our thinking. But for me, I try and steer clear of those things in terms of trying to look at the bigger picture. What is morally right? What is morally just, et cetera, et cetera. And I walked through that whole process. And not only is it morally right for us to serve, I believe we have a responsibility to serve. If we have masjids, Islamic centers, businesses, and anything else in this country that we can claim to be our own, then we have a responsibility to protect and defend them against any enemy, foreign and domestic. Period.
All right. We got 2 questions, but we have 1 minute. So be very concise in what you're saying. Thank you.
And I heard that, so I'll be quick too in my answer.
Can you tell me if there's any difference between being a female chaplain or a male chaplain?
One is female and one is male? That's the obvious difference. That's a quick answer too. Next.
All right, next.
No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, there are some differences, particularly in the military. We do not have any female Muslim chaplains in the military, and there's a specific reason for that, as opposed to in the prison systems, where we do have female Muslim chaplains that basically minister to a female population exclusively. In the military, the female chaplain would be required to do all of the things that a male chaplain does. But we know that there's still a consensus amongst the scholars in Islam that only a male can lead the salah. And so if that remains unchanged. And with a fast-changing world, if that remains unchanged, then that particular edict will also remain unchanged in the military.
All right, last question.
Actually, the comment related to the question the brother raised, the Muslim community relatively is still new in the U.S. Like it has been, I know there is all the Muslims who lived here, but the larger existing Muslim population is still new. And they are facing challenges on all levels, in the army, in the street, everywhere. And we have to establish ourselves as Muslims, and we have to show who we are in the army and everywhere else. Most Muslims, mashallah, we have lots of Muslim physicians, and that interact with a very also reliable community. We need to utilize our resources and let people know who Muslims are, so we remove all those stereotypes, because nobody else will work on it, nobody else will erase it except us.
Yes.
So, and that is everywhere. It's not
Yes.
just in the army, everywhere. Maybe except in medicine, because people, you interact with people who appreciate what you are doing, but we need to transform that to every other areas, and we need to show what the real Islam is and who are the real Muslims who have been, Islam has been around for 1400 some years, and civilization has been established, and people who interacted with Muslims know who Muslims are. We need to establish that here as well.
Yeah, just 10 seconds. The last thing that I will say is that it is not the responsibility, when it comes to military service, soldiers and their leaders do not determine who the enemy is. Politicians do. We fight where we're told to fight. We do not determine where the fight is going to be. So if you don't like who the enemy is, change your politicians. That means you have to vote.
Can you just wait? I will request a standing ovation for Brother Abdul Rasheed. Thank you so much for your service. Thank you. Because the reason being that in the media, everywhere we hear about Twin Towers and terrorism and Muslim being terrorists, nobody talks about the mosque, the Islamic Center in those Twin Towers. Nobody talks about the Muslim soldiers still fighting this war. Nobody talks about the Muslim casualty, and nobody talks about the great Muslim chaplain. So thank you so much for your services.